War has always been one of the most expensive ventures humanity can undertake. But even by those standards, Russia's invasion of Ukraine stands out as one of the most financially devastating conflicts in recent history. From the very first day of the invasion, the Kremlin has been funneling unimaginable amounts of money into the war, hundreds of billions of dollars in total. And with every passing month, that figure climbs higher. The longer the fighting continues, the more it's draining Russia from within. What started as a campaign to project strength has slowly turned into a massive financial sinkhole, consuming the nation's wealth, workforce, and future stability. Bit by bit, Vladimir Putin's war machine is bleeding the Russian economy dry. In the early years of the conflict, Moscow seemed confident. The Kremlin had spent years preparing for this scenario, expecting that harsh Western sanctions would follow any invasion of Ukraine. Russia had taken steps to shield itself, cutting back on foreign debt, stockpiling foreign currency reserves, reducing its reliance on Western technologies, and building up its national wealth fund, a massive state savings account now widely referred to as Putin's war chest. At the same time, Russia worked hard to strengthen trade ties with non-Western partners, especially China and India. The Kremlin believed that as long as these two economic giants kept buying Russian oil and gas, the country would be able to withstand whatever punishments the West threw its way. And for a time, it seemed to work. When the first waves of sanctions hit in 2022 and 2023, the Russian economy didn't collapse as many predicted. The ruble stabilized, government revenues stayed strong, and Putin boasted that Russia's economy was far tougher than the West had believed. But as the war dragged on, the cracks began to show. Each new wave of sanctions added pressure, and the strain of financing such a massive war effort became more visible. The Kremlin's enormous military spending, once seen as proof of national strength, is now slowly destroying the very economy it was meant to protect. Today, Putin faces a painful dilemma. If he keeps pouring money into the war, he weakens his country from within. But if he cuts back on defense spending, Russia's economy will likely tip into recession anyway. It's a no-win situation, a trap with no clear way out. According to economists, there's no sustainable path forward for Russia under current conditions. The government can choose only between bad and worse. That might explain why Moscow's newest federal budget includes one of the highest levels of military spending in modern Russian history. In 2026 alone, the Kremlin plans to dedicate a staggering 38% of its entire federal budget to the military and security sector. To put that into perspective, very few countries in the world, even during wartime, come anywhere close to that proportion. Under the draft budget for 2026-2028, the government will allocate about 12.9 trillion rubles, roughly $159 billion for defense in 2026. On paper, that represents a small 4.4% reduction from 2025 levels, but the number is misleading. When you include the extra money for police, intelligence agencies, and the security apparatus, total spending rises to more than 16.8 trillion rubles, or around $207 billion. And even those numbers may not tell the full story. Insiders familiar with Russia's budget process say the government often hides additional war expenses from the public. Secret defense allocations, hidden transfers, and emergency top-ups have become the norm. For example, in 2025, an extra 30 billion rubles were quietly handed to Promsvya's bank, a state-controlled bank that serves Russia's military-industrial sector. Similar covert injections are almost guaranteed to happen again in 2026 and beyond. One government source told Reuters that if heavy fighting resumes, the Kremlin can add funding at any moment. In fact, the 2027 budget already forecasts higher spending than 2025, a sign that Putin intends to keep pushing forward, regardless of economic cost. But how does Russia plan to pay for this? The answer, unfortunately for its citizens, is simple: higher taxes. The Finance Ministry has proposed raising the value-added tax, or VAT, to 22%, alongside several other tax increases. In effect, ordinary Russians and domestic businesses will be forced to foot the bill for the war. The government promises that essential goods like food, children's products, and medicine will keep a reduced 10% VAT rate. But even with those exemptions, the tax hike will make daily life more expensive for everyone. Economists warn it will trigger another round of inflation and price hikes across almost every sector, at a time when many families are already struggling to get by. The Kremlin insists the new budget is under control. Spokesman Dmitry Peskov described it as absolutely balanced, calling the tax increases a normal process for a nation at this stage of development. He wrapped the message in patriotism, saying that victory must be achieved for the sake of our children and grandchildren. But fewer and fewer Russians are buying that message. Public opinion polls suggest that the majority of citizens would now prefer peace negotiations over continued war. As the cost of living rises and savings disappear, many people are beginning to connect their economic hardship directly to the war in Ukraine and to Putin himself. Still, the Kremlin believes it must show defiance. Russian economist Vadim Baranov told Reuters that the so-called war budget serves a symbolic purpose: to prove that Russia's domestic and foreign priorities haven't changed. In other words, the massive military spending isn't just financial, it's political. It's the Kremlin's way of telling the world that Russia won't back down, won't negotiate, and won't admit defeat. By projecting confidence through spending, Putin hopes to intimidate Ukraine and its allies, to send a message that Russia can continue this war indefinitely. But in reality, the opposite may be true. Moscow's finances are stretched thinner every month, and the underlying economy is breaking apart. At the 2025 St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, senior Russian bankers and officials sounded alarm bells. German Greff, the head of Sberbank, warned that economic growth was approaching zero and that the central bank needed to act fast to prevent stagnation. The Minister of Economic Development, Maxim Reshetnikov, admitted that Russia was teetering on the brink of recession, yet the government pressed on with its war spending. The choice between saving the economy or continuing the war has already been made, and Putin chose the war. For a while, Russia's energy industry had helped cushion the blow. Oil and gas revenues had always been the backbone of the economy, making up around 1/5 of the federal budget. But even that sector is now showing signs of collapse. Ukraine's targeted strikes on refineries, fuel depots, and pipelines have seriously damaged Russia's energy infrastructure. Production is down, exports are more complicated, and profits are shrinking fast. Meanwhile, 3 deep structural problems are pulling the economy down. The first is sanctions. Early in the war, Russia managed to adapt to them. But over time, sanctions have isolated the country from global financial systems, made imports far more expensive, and cut off key technologies. Western nations are preparing even more restrictive measures against Russian oligarchs, banks, and companies, ensuring that the pressure won't ease anytime soon. The second issue is a massive labor shortage. Hundreds of thousands of working-age men have been mobilized or recruited for the front lines. On top of that, around 1 million Russians, many of them young, educated professionals, have fled the country since 2022. They've built new lives abroad, taking their skills and productivity with them. Inside Russia, countless industries are now short-staffed, from construction and mining to transportation and agriculture. And with every new wave of mobilization, the situation worsens. The third major problem is inflation, fueled by the Kremlin's relentless defense spending. The central bank has tried to rein it in by hiking interest rates, but that has made borrowing nearly impossible. Businesses can't afford loans, people can't buy homes, and consumer spending has dropped sharply. High prices, high taxes, and high interest rates have combined to choke off growth. Russia's 2026 budget does nothing to fix these problems. Taxes will rise, inflation will remain high, and civilian industries will continue to wither. Elena Rybakova, a senior researcher at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, warned that these policies will keep strangling private enterprise while making the state even more dependent on the military-industrial complex. That dependence is dangerous. Entire regions of Russia now rely on defense contracts for jobs and income. If the Kremlin ever tried to cut military spending to end the war, it would trigger mass unemployment and regional economic collapse. Economists compare it to the 2008 global financial crisis, except instead of a housing bubble, Russia has built a war bubble. So much money, labor, and infrastructure are tied up in the defense industry that the rest of the economy is being starved. And when that bubble eventually bursts, the crash will be severe. Alexander Kuzmin, head of a Russian economic think tank, described the current situation as a catch-22. Russia can't survive without the military-industrial complex, but that same complex is consuming the economy from within. There's no clear exit, only an inevitable decline. When the recession finally hits, the consequences will be grim. Shrinking production, rising unemployment, falling wages, and widespread poverty. Ordinary Russians will become even poorer, and many will finally realize the true cost of the war. The anger and disillusionment that follow could become one of the biggest political threats Putin has ever faced. For years, analysts predicted that sanctions and the freezing of foreign assets would eventually drive Russia into recession. But ironically, the most destructive force may turn out to be the Kremlin's own decisions. Putin's obsession with funding the war has pushed Russia into a downward spiral of its own making. The recession is no longer a question of if, but when, and when it comes, the depth of the crash will depend entirely on how long the Kremlin keeps fueling the conflict. The more it spends, the worse the ultimate collapse will be. Yet stopping the spending could cause that collapse even sooner. The only real path out of the crisis would be through diplomacy, through ending the war and negotiating a genuine peace deal that could lead to sanctions relief. That, in turn, would reopen trade, attract investment, and bring money flowing back into the economy. But so far, the Kremlin has shown little interest in that option. Putin and his top officials continue to reject every opportunity to sit down with Ukraine or Western leaders. For now, they appear determined to fight on, no matter the cost. And so, the war continues. The bombs keep falling, and the Russian economy continues to unravel, slipping further into decline, weighed down by its own militarization. For Russia, the question is no longer about victory on the battlefield. It's about survival, and how long the country can keep digging before the hole becomes too deep to climb out of.